Hello and welcome to Between the Covers with Danielle. I'm Danielle Robinson, and on this channel I talk about literature beyond the obvious, the books, categories and reading paths that sit just outside the mainstream conversation. Today's episode is about obscure genres, not obscure books necessarily, but genres that don't advertise themselves well. The kinds of literary categories you often don't realize you're reading until you stop and look at the pattern. Because some of the most interesting reading happens when you step away from the bestseller lists and trend cycles and start paying attention to how books are working, not just what they're about. So in this episode, I'm mapping a handful of under-discussed genres: slow catastrophe, philosophical fiction, feminist realism, eco-literary fiction, and hybrid memoir, and using a single anchor text for each to show how these genres operate and why they're worth paying attention to. This isn't about hype. It's about classification, curiosity, and reading more intelligently. Let's get into it. So for today's wine, I've gone with something that feels very on theme for this episode. A bit under the radar, a bit rule-breaking, and genuinely good value. My favorite non-Tasmanian Pinot Noir. This is the Dudet Nodin 2023 Pinot Noir, and while Dudet Nodin is a historic Burgundy house founded back in 1849, this particular wine doesn't play by the usual Burgundy rules. The fruit actually comes from the Aude Valley near the Pyrenees, and because of that, it's labelled Vin de France rather than a traditional appellation. And honestly, that freedom really works in its favour. Now, I've opened it earlier to let it breathe, so let's pour some in the glass. It's still very early in the morning while I'm filming this, so I feel a little bit guilty having a drink this early in the day when it's not Christmas. So let's have a look, first of all, in the glass and see what we have. Now, on the palate, it's very clean and bright. There's blackcurrant, cherry, blackberry, nothing overripe or jammy, and the acidity is really lively without being sharp. It almost reminds me of a Chablis in red form. It's bone dry, tight, steely, but still enjoyable. The tannins are quite gentle, sort of lightly sandy, almost, I don't know, Velcro-ish, enough structure to give it shape, but nothing heavy or aggressive. And the finish hangs around longer than you'd expect for a wine at this price point, with a little apple skin freshness right at the end. This is absolutely a drink now Pinot. It's not trying to be profound, and it's not pretending to be something it's not. It's just very easy to like. Food-wise, this would be great with roast chicken, veal with a mushroom sauce, or even grilled sausages. Something savoury, not too heavy. For me, this is a solid 3.5 stars. It's well made, good value, and very drinkable, especially if you like Pinot Noir that leans fresh rather than plush. If you can still find a bottle, it's worth picking up. Though fair warning, it does seem to be a bit of a victim of its own success. I wouldn't cellar this. It's definitely not a cellaring wine. It's a wine that you buy and you drink pretty much straight away. So it's time for me to have some. God, I wish it wasn't so early in the day now. When people hear apocalypse, they expect fire, panic, spectacle, zombies. But the most honest catastrophes don't happen like that. They arrive slowly, bureaucratically, historically. War and Peace is, to me, one of the greatest quiet catastrophe novels ever written. Yes, it's about war, but not in the cinematic sense. What Tolstoy gives us instead is attrition, lives slowly redirected, futures quietly foreclosed, people adapting to instability so gradually they don't even notice who they've become. War and Peace is a huge novel, but the basic idea is actually pretty simple. It's set in Russia during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, and it follows a group of interconnected families as war slowly starts to shape every part of their lives. The story mainly centers on three people. There's Pierre, who suddenly inherits a massive fortune and spends most of the book trying to work out who he's supposed to be and what any of this money, society, war actually means. Then there's Prince Andrei, who starts out believing war will give his life purpose and glory, and gradually realizes how hollow that idea is. And then there's Natasha, who's young, emotional, impulsive, and very alive, and whose coming of age happens right alongside the country falling apart. What's interesting is that War and Peace isn't really about battles, even though there are famous ones in it. It spends just as much time on dinner parties, awkward conversations, family drama, marriages, heartbreak, and small personal decisions. War isn't dramatic here. It's confusing, exhausting, and it's often random. As Napoleon's invasion unfolds and Moscow is eventually abandoned, the novel shows how people don't so much rise to the occasion as they adapt, cope, and make do. Big historical events happen, but most lives change quietly, almost by accident. By the end, it's less about war or peace as ideas and more about how people live through long periods of uncertainty and how history reshapes them, whether they're ready or not. This is slow catastrophe as lived experience. No single moment destroys the world, but everything changes anyway. That, for me, is the essence of this genre. Philosophical fiction doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't ask what happens next. It asks something quieter. What counts as a life, and who gets to decide? Stoner is a novel where almost nothing happens, at least in the way we're trained to expect. There are no grand achievements, no dramatic reversals, no late vindication. Unfortunately, I've lent my copy out, so I don't have it with me today. The philosophy here isn't delivered through arguments or ideas on the page. It's embedded in repetition, routine, compromise, and endurance. Stoner makes choices, but most of his life is shaped by circumstance, institutional power, and the slow narrowing of possibility. What the book quietly asks is whether meaning has to look like success, whether commitment, attention, and persistence are enough, even when no one is watching, applauding, or remembering. Stoner follows the life of William Stoner, an unremarkable man born on a small farm in Missouri in the late 1800s. His parents sent him to university to study agriculture, but once he's there, he discovers literature. And that discovery quietly changes the direction of his entire life. Stoner abandons the farm, becomes an English academic, and spends decades teaching at the same university. There's no dramatic rise or fall here. His career is modest, his ambitions are limited, and for the most part, the world barely notices him. At home, his marriage is unhappy and emotionally distant. At work, he becomes embroiled in petty academic politics that slowly sideline him. He experiences love once, briefly and intensely, and then loses it. He raises a daughter he adores, only to watch that relationship slowly slip away too. What the novel does, very deliberately, is refuse to sensationalize any of this. There are no big redemptions, no last-minute triumphs. Life simply unfolds, year by year, shaped by habit, compromise, and quiet endurance. By the time Stoner reaches the end of his life, the book asks a deceptively simple question: what if a life doesn't need to be exceptional to be meaningful? That's where Stoner becomes philosophical, not by arguing ideas, but by making you sit with an ordinary life and decide for yourself whether that was enough. This is philosophical fiction as lived experience. No existential speeches, no conclusions neatly tied up. just a life examined carefully and left for the reader to judge. This is feminist fiction that works through social reality, not slogans or symbolism. The Crimson Petal and the White is set in Victorian London, and what it does very deliberately is place two women on opposite ends of respectability and shows how little freedom either of them actually has. This is a big, immersive novel set in the 1870s, and it centers on the two women whose lives end up orbiting the same man. First, there's Sugar, a 19-year-old sex worker in a brothel run by the intimidating Mrs. Castaway. Sugar is unusually intelligent, self-educated and ambitious, and she's desperate to claw her way out of poverty and into a life choices. Then there's Agnes Rackham, the respectable wife, sheltered, fragile, and raised to be decorative rather than informed. She's completely kept in the dark about her own body and sexuality, and as the story goes on, it becomes obvious how trapped she is inside the idea of the perfect Victorian woman. Linking them is William Rackham, the heir to a perfume fortune, not a grand villain, more like a weak, self-absorbed man drifting through privilege. He becomes infatuated with Sugar, and what starts as an affair turns into a messy entanglement that pulls Sugar closer to his world and pushes Agnes further into isolation. What makes the novel feel feminist, without it ever turning into a lecture, is that it shows how Victorian society is basically a machine that uses women differently depending on their class, but still corners them either way. It's not just about scandal, it's about power, money, control, and what respectability costs. That's why it works so well as feminist fiction. It doesn't argue a point, it demonstrates one. By the end, you're left with a very clear picture of how a system can limit women's choices without ever needing to announce itself as cruel. Climate fiction often tries to scare us. Migrations does something more effective. It makes us mourn. This is a novel about extinction that barely raises its voice. Species disappear, landscapes empty out. The grief is cumulative, not dramatic. This is set in a near future where climate change has pushed the natural world to the brink. Animal species are disappearing, the oceans are close to empty, and extinction isn't a distant concept anymore. It's the background noise of daily life. The story's told by Franny Lynch, a restless, complicated woman with a lot of grief in her past. She becomes obsessed with one thing, following what may be the last migration of Arctic terns, tiny seabirds known for traveling enormous distances each year. Franny believes that if she can track them, she might learn something that could help save them, or at least bear witness to what's being lost. She heads to Greenland and convinces Ennis Malone, the captain of a struggling fishing vessel, to take her on board. The plan is simple in theory: follow the birds as they move south. In reality, it's dangerous, exhausting, and increasingly illegal in a world tightening environmental restrictions. As the voyage unfolds, the book shifts between Franny's present journey at sea and her earlier life, her childhood in Ireland, her relationships, and the personal tragedies she's been running from for years. So, yes, it's a climate novel, but it's also a story about restlessness, guilt, and what people do when they don't know how to live with what they've lost. That's what makes it eco-literary. The environmental collapse is real, but the book's power comes from how intimately it shows grief for species, for places, for the parts of ourselves we can't outrun. What I love about this book is that the environmental collapse is almost peripheral. The real story is how people carry loss, how absence becomes a companion. This is ecological catastrophe written as elegy. This is another book that I can't find, but some of the most interesting books right now don't sit comfortably in a single genre. Minor Feelings is one of those. It lives somewhere between memoir, cultural criticism, history, and essay, and it's deliberately resistant to being boxed in. Minor Feelings isn't a memoir in the traditional neat timeline sense. It's more like a series of essays that circle the same emotional terrain from different angles. Identity, race, invisibility, anger, shame, and the quiet exhaustion of trying to belong in a culture that keeps pretending you already do. Cathy Park Hong weaves together her own life, growing up as the child of Korean immigrants, navigating elite creative spaces, dealing with depression, with cultural criticism, history, and politics. She talks about what she calls minor feelings, those low-grade, hard-to-name emotions that come from being constantly overlooked, subtly dismissed, or expected to be grateful just for being allowed in the room. There's no single storyline here. Instead, Hong moves between personal memories, pop culture, literary criticism, and historical context, showing how Asian American identity has been flattened by stereotypes like the model minority myth, and how damaging that erasure really is. She's particularly sharp on how institutions like academia, publishing, and even therapy can reinforce silence rather than challenge it. What makes the book powerful is that it doesn't try to resolve these tensions. There's no tidy healing arc. It's messy, unresolved, and deliberately uncomfortable because that's the point. Minor Feelings sits right at the intersection of memoir, essay, and manifesto, and it's less about telling a life story than about naming an experience that rarely gets named at all. This isn't a book that offers conclusions. It offers language for experiences that often go unnamed. What links all of these books isn't time period, genre label, or popularity, it's scale. These are books that understand catastrophe as something that seeps rather than strikes, that meaning erodes before buildings fall, that systems fail long before anyone calls it a crisis. They taught me that my favorite books don't need to shout. They need to stay. If you're feeling disconnected from reading lately, I don't think the problem is you. I think the loudest books are rarely the deepest ones. Sometimes the stories that change us most are hiding in plain sight, inside genres we never thought to name, inside books we thought we already understood. If you've read something that quietly ruined you, something that didn't explode but never let go, I want to hear about it. And if this episode resonated, there's more coming. Because once you start reading this way, there's no going back. Thanks for being here. From me and Oscar, we'll see you in the next one.